A coup was attempted in Burkina Faso and it failed, but instead of collapsing, the country lit a fuse that's now burning across all of Africa. But how did one failed plot turn into a continent-wide military revolution? Let's find out. Officially, the government said the coup was foiled by swift intelligence and loyal military intervention, but that's the polished version. What happened goes deeper and darker. What failed that night wasn't just a tactical operation. What failed was a script, a decades-old blueprint that had worked in countless African countries before. Destabilize a rising nationalist leader, exploit internal divisions, coordinate with foreign actors under the guise of restoring order, and then reinstall a puppet with a Western handshake. This time, it didn't work. Why? Because the enemy misunderstood one key thing. Traoré was not isolated, he was embedded. Not in luxury offices or overseas diplomatic circles, but in the ranks of the common soldier and the minds of the angry youth. The plan relied on splitting the military from the presidency, but it overlooked something crucial. The rank and file didn't view Traoré as the government. They saw him as their man, a fellow soldier who had bled in the dirt, not dined in marble halls. So when whispers of a coup began circulating, the intelligence didn't just come from official agencies. It came from within the very barracks the plotters thought they controlled. This isn't the first time a coup has been attempted in Burkina Faso. But what made this one different was the enemy's desperation. It wasn't just internal. The plot had fingerprints from abroad. Intelligence traced suspicious coordination back to Ivory Coast, a country with deep Western military ties and long-standing tensions with revolutionary regimes in the region. At least 3 of the key coup architects were said to be in direct communication with non-state armed groups, loosely branded as insurgents, but often used as proxies in the shadow games of foreign powers. And then there was the most grotesque part of the plan, the manipulation of traditional and religious leaders. The coup architects believed they could sway public opinion, not by facts, but by belief. If they could get the imams and the chiefs on their side, they could create the illusion of legitimacy. They weren't just planning a takeover. They were trying to hijack the soul of the nation. What they didn't account for was the intelligence network growing around Traoré, not through wiretaps or satellites, but through human trust. Local informants, disillusioned ex-comrades, even minor officers quietly monitor unusual activity in their circles. The truth is, the people around Traoré weren't loyal out of fear. They were loyal because they saw in him something rare. A leader who wasn't asking them to die for his power, but to live for their country. And so, when the arrests began and the trap was sprung, it wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Traoré's government moved faster than the plotters expected. Safe houses were raided, weapons caches were seized, key coordinators were intercepted while making final calls. What was supposed to be a sudden storm turned into a sputtering drizzle, and by morning, it was over. But the aftershock wasn't. Because of stopping the coup, the government exposed more than a few conspirators. They exposed a truth too big to be unlearned. That betrayal runs deep, and that the most dangerous threats aren't always the ones with guns. They're the ones with contracts, backroom deals, and passports from other nations. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was a rude awakening. For the military across Africa, it was a revelation. Because what was once whispered, that internal collaborators and foreign hands work in unison to suffocate African independence, had now been confirmed on the national stage. That night, a coup failed. But what it revealed would never be forgotten. And as word spread, from soldier to soldier, from WhatsApp group to village radio, another question began to form in the minds of Africa's forgotten fighters. If this is what they're willing to do to one man who stands for us, then who else has been lying to us all along? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. In the aftermath of the failed coup, something invisible but irreversible began to move across the Sahel. It didn't wear uniforms. It didn't raise flags. It traveled in thoughts, in glances between soldiers, in the quiet resolve forming behind tired eyes. While the international media covered arrests and speculated about foreign involvement, a more profound revolution had already begun, inside the barracks. Across Africa, especially in countries plagued by conflict, A silent tension had been building for years between two groups within the military: the entrenched elite and the forgotten foot soldier. On paper, they wore the same uniforms. In reality, they lived in two different worlds. The older generals, polished, diplomatic, and fluent in French politics, had grown rich and untouchable. They made speeches about patriotism at podiums funded by foreign donors. Meanwhile, the younger soldiers bled in forests and deserts, burying comrades without medals or headlines, and wondering why their sacrifices changed nothing. So when the coup in Burkina Faso collapsed and the layers of betrayal were peeled back, these young men saw more than a failed power grab. They saw themselves in a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw standing behind them. They began to question not only their commanders, but the entire structure they had sworn to protect. If the betrayal of Traoré was possible at that level, orchestrated not by insurgents, but by men who once wore the same badge, then what exactly were they fighting for? The answer came not through ideology, but identification. Traoré wasn't a politician in camouflage. He was one of them, a captain, not a general. A man who rose not by selling his loyalty, but by defending it. He had faced the same enemy, walked the same terrain, and commanded not from an air-conditioned office, but from the dust and danger of the front lines. To the disillusioned youth across African militaries, this wasn't just admirable, it was liberating. They began asking forbidden questions. Why do our generals serve foreign diplomats more than our people? Why do we need training from nations that couldn't stop our enemies? Why are we told to protect borders that exist to protect foreign assets, not African lives? These questions didn't need answers. They only needed courage. And Traoré's survival gave them that courage. His refusal to back down, his exposure of collaborators, and his clear rejection of Western interference made one thing undeniable: it could be done. One didn't have to sell out to lead. One didn't have to beg to govern. One didn't have to fear the empire to stand with the people. The spark spread. In Mali, officers who had long watched their commanders drink with foreign envoys while their villages suffered finally snapped the chain. In Niger, junior ranks began to doubt the loyalty of their superiors. In Guinea, soldiers once content with silence began drafting manifestos. The failed coup didn't just inspire, it legitimized rebellion. Not rebellion for its own sake, but rebellion with memory. They remembered what the West called democracy, elections rigged by French consultants. They remembered what the West called security, drone strikes and abandoned promises. They remembered what they were taught to salute, a flag co-owned by debt and dependency. But now there was another option. Not perfect, not without risk, but undeniably theirs. And something else changed too: the language. Soldiers stopped speaking in terms of orders and operations. They started speaking of duty and dignity. The whispers turned into statements. The statements turned into action. Some resigned. Some joined the civilian resistance. Some began preparing quietly, building coalitions of their own. Not to overthrow governments, but to replace systems that had long stopped serving the African soldier and citizen alike. This wasn't a political movement in the traditional sense. It didn't need manifestos or campaign slogans. It didn't need votes. It only needed a question passed from man to man, across trenches and tents, across rivers and red lines. If Traoré could survive and fight back, why can't we? In that question lived the seeds of a revolution far larger than one nation. It wasn't about loyalty to Traoré as a man, but to what he represented. The return of honor to the uniform, of sovereignty to the land, and power to those who bled for it. The world saw Burkina Faso avoid a coup, but the soldiers saw something else. They saw the beginning of a military awakening, and the end of obedience without purpose. And as this transformation gained momentum, the next logical step became obvious. If your command chain is compromised, and your enemy wears your insignia, then your next move isn't internal, it's geopolitical. The moment the uniform stopped meaning obedience to foreign-backed generals, something else had to shift: the direction of allegiance. In the minds of thousands of African soldiers who watched Traoré survive betrayal and stand taller afterward, one realization became inescapable. Loyalty is not enough without independence. And you cannot be independent while your country still answers to old colonial command centers, be they in Paris, Washington, or Brussels. As the military mindset changed, so did the map. Young soldiers didn't just want to overthrow corrupt elites, They wanted to know who those elites were working for. They traced weapons shipments. They followed military trainers back to embassies. They looked at mining contracts, aid agreements, and security pacts, and realized they were living in countries that looked free on paper but were occupied in practice. And the occupying forces weren't wearing boots anymore. They wore suits, held passports, and called themselves partners. Nowhere was this more obvious than in Burkina Faso's relationship with France. For decades, France had operated under the illusion that it still owned a moral stake in its former colonies. It deployed troops, hosted regional summits, and branded itself as the security backbone of West Africa. But when insurgent attacks continued despite French military presence, and villages kept burning despite French intelligence, the illusion collapsed. French helicopters flew overhead while militants scared people below. Soldiers died with rusted rifles while French mining firms posted record profits. So when Traoré told France to leave, it wasn't just a foreign policy move, it was a declaration of psychological independence. And when the people cheered, that was the real revolution. This reaction stunned Western observers. Why would anyone celebrate the departure of allies? Why would African soldiers wave Russian flags in the streets? Because symbols matter, because flags tell stories. And to the growing revolutionary movement spreading across Sahelian armies, the French flag represented humiliation, manipulation, and memories of stolen futures. The Russian flag, whether out of strategy, protest, or defiance, came to represent something else: the right to choose your enemies and your friends on your terms. Make no mistake, this wasn't a naive love affair with Moscow. The African soldiers weren't blind to Russia's flaws. They knew about Wagner, about authoritarianism, about manipulation. But what Russia represented to them was a break in the cycle. Russia offered weapons without lectures, support without regime change threats, a chessboard position that could unsettle the Western monopoly on African fate. And it wasn't just military. The cultural shift was visible. Burkina Faso's state broadcasters stopped recycling Eurocentric narratives. Local language programming returned. Statues of colonial officers were replaced with statues of African revolutionaries. Maps were redrawn not with borders, but with alliances that reflected modern interests, not 1960s hand-me-downs from decolonization treaties. Other countries followed. In Mali, after the French exit, military leaders doubled down on local sovereignty and demanded respect as equals. In Niger, soldiers accused French officials of orchestrating influence campaigns inside their military structure. In Guinea, Russian delegations were greeted not with suspicion, but with curiosity, as alternatives, not replacements. This wasn't about loving Moscow, it was about burying Paris. And what scared the West most wasn't military realignment, it was ideological detachment. Because once a soldier no longer believes in your aid, no longer salutes your mission, considers your flag a friend, he is no longer yours to manage. He is free. The failed coup in Burkina Faso did more than expose traitors. It ignited a shift in consciousness. Soldiers stopped asking what their countries could get from the West and started asking what the West had already taken. They stopped waiting for permission to defend their homelands and started declaring that defense means self-determination, not subcontracting. And the Western response? Denial, sanctions, think tank papers warning of Russian influence. But no one in Bamako or Niamey was listening anymore. Because while Western analysts tried to frame this as geopolitical chess, African soldiers were busy cleaning their rifles, printing new national constitutions, and studying how to secure independence without debt. The streets made it clear. The barracks made it clear. The flags made it clear. The post-colonial handshake had been rejected. This was no longer about coups or political reshuffling. This was a continental realignment, forged not in boardrooms but in bunkers, built not on theories but on survival. And once you change the map, once you decide who belongs inside your walls and who doesn't, the final confrontation becomes inevitable. What do you do with those inside your house who were feeding your enemies all along? When a nation expels foreign influence, it does not automatically become free. Freedom, real freedom, isn't just about closing embassies or rejecting foreign troops. It's about removing the internal machinery that allowed them to control you in the first place. And once Burkina Faso turned its back on France and stared down the West, the next target was clear: not the enemy at the gate, but the traitor in the hall. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his allies knew that the coup attempt wasn't just a foreign conspiracy, it had domestic fingerprints. Men who wore the same flag had turned it into currency. Ex-generals, political elites, and high-ranking civil servants had long served as the domestic brokers of foreign interests. Some had coordinated with mercenaries, others with multinational corporations. Many more simply stood by, hands folded, while their country was carved into zones of influence. Their loyalty wasn't to Burkina Faso. It was to access, to status, and survival under someone else's rule. But after the failed coup, that luxury expired. The revolution could no longer afford neutrality. It had to purge. And Traoré's administration understood this with a clarity that previous governments never dared to act on. It wasn't just about jailing plotters. It was about dismantling the ecosystem of betrayal that had allowed such a plot to grow in the first place. Ministries were overhauled, military ranks were audited, civilian departments were scrutinized for leaks, double loyalties, and foreign financial ties. Dozens were removed. Some were prosecuted. Others simply vanished from public life. But this wasn't chaos. It was order reclaimed. And as Burkina Faso began its internal reckoning, it didn't do so quietly. This was a revolution that refused to apologize for defending itself. Public trials were held, names were named, tapes were leaked. It wasn't just a cleansing, it was a lesson, a warning to others in positions of power across Africa. The days of quietly selling your nation from behind a desk were over. This wave of accountability rippled beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Mali, where a similar military leadership had taken charge, rumors of internal audits began to surface. In Niger, documents linking former military officers to French intelligence started appearing online. In Guinea, mid-level officials began resigning before investigations could even begin. Across the Sahel, the old system wasn't just under threat, it was bleeding credibility, and the people could smell it. What made this revolution different from past coups was its moral clarity. This wasn't about one faction seizing power from another. It wasn't palace politics, it was a generational and ideological cleansing. Traoré and others like him didn't rise on the promise of wealth or political longevity. They rose with a mission: to sever the umbilical cord between African leadership and foreign dependence. And that meant uprooting the local facilitators of that dependence. And those facilitators weren't always wearing suits or stars on their shoulders. Some were media owners spreading narratives imported from Paris. Others were NGO leaders funneling intelligence under the banner of humanitarian aid. Some were religious leaders, paid to preach peace while discouraging resistance. But the revolution saw them all, and named them all. In this internal war, no corner was sacred. Even within the revolutionary camp, those who began to soften or hesitate were quietly pushed aside. Loyalty to the people, and to the sovereignty they had bled for, became the only currency that mattered. But this internal cleansing wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoring trust. The people had already shown they would rally behind soldiers, but now they needed to believe their institutions wouldn't betray them again. They needed to know that the same ministries that once served foreign banks were now building roads, schools, and local industries without strings attached. Traoré knew that the revolution couldn't survive on fire alone. It needed construction. And cleansing the house was the first step to rebuilding one worth living in. A new Burkina Faso, and potentially a new Sahel, couldn't be led by men with two faces. The time of double agents in traditional robes or military fatigues had ended. Now was the time for a new leadership class, forged not in European universities, but in the battle for African dignity. This is why the failed coup was more than a security threat. It was an X-ray, revealing where the disease still lived. And for the first time in decades, a government didn't just diagnose the infection, it began the surgery. And so, what began as a failed plot became a purification ritual, one that tore away the old skin and forced a nation and a region to see itself clearly for the first time. Now the world watches with unease. But inside Africa, something is stirring that can no longer be ignored. If the traitors have been exposed and the people have chosen their side and the soldiers have stopped obeying foreign ghosts, then what's left to stop this revolution from rewriting the future of the entire continent? Nothing? Do you think it's too late for coup attempts to work? Why is the West embarrassing itself? Let us know in the comments section. Will locals let they take Traoré? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.